Welcome to the podcast. My name is Chris Hall. This is the Peak Provider NDIS podcast. And today I'm honored to have Drew Beswick with me. Now, Drew is a fascinating man because he wears many hats as a CEO. In the disability side of things, he's actually involved in 3 organizations. So we're going to talk today about lifestyle solutions and Possability primarily, and they're part of the Alliance 20 organization, which represents approximately 10% of all billings in the NDIS. So it's really, great today to have that level of conversation. And Drew's also involved in another organization in the SDA side of things. So before I go into any of the questions, let me welcome Drew to the podcast. It really is a pleasure to have you on.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for that. And yeah, look, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for your interest. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I'm a bit of a geek as a business coach, so I just love, talking strategy, talking vision, and how you get to these things. So let's go into it. So I suppose, with Lifestyle Solutions and Possability, the 2 large organizations. You're the CEO of both. What's it like wearing 2 hats across, not just 2 brands, but 2 full operational units of business?
Yeah, look, good question. I think as much as the organisations have their distinct differences, I think there's a lot of commonality as well. These are 2, I guess, modern not-for-profits in sort of the traditional sense, non-aligned, so they're not come from any sort of faith-based background or the like, so very much been pursuing their mission and pursuing really an agenda of human rights in all the work that they've been doing. For Possability, Possability is a bit over 30 years old and started up here in Tasmania when the Tasmanian government was looking to close down the large institutions that were quite familiar across much of Australia at the time. And so Optia was actually the company that was set up in response to that, and took only a small portion of services from government and tried to provide services for people in the community, largely people who'd been living in what was called Willow Court in New Norfolk at the time, and really looking at supporting people with complex and challenging behavioural needs in the community. So that's kind of been the DNA of Possability, and as the Tasmanian government continued to build the community sector in response to their reform of disability support services, Possability just continued to grow, and so very much had a focus on sort of complex supports and specialist supports, and really trying to build the independence of the people we support, as well as be a voice for and a champion for change in the community. And that's something that we've taken really seriously through our history. And with Lifestyle Solutions, again, another modern by sort of, I guess, any standard organisation that started up in Newcastle about a bit over 30 years ago again, but has a focus on working with children who can't be at home in the out-of-home care system, and it does some really important work in that area as well, and so has more of a geographic spread right across Australia in providing those services. And has really prided itself on working with people in really challenging circumstances and trying to hang in there to make sure that that an outcome can be sort of sought. So there's some commonalities as well as some differences between the 2 organisations, and some great people and some great work happening right across them. So whilst there's a lot on and a lot to do, I'm very well supported by a really capable and well-intentioned team, and some amazing support staff right across the country. So on that level, it's really satisfying. But like any organisation working in the current environment, it has its challenges from day to day as well.
Okay. So, I know that Lifestyle Solutions and Possability are actually, I believe, coming together as one organization. Okay, so that's really interesting to me. So you've got the deep history of Tasmania, 30 years old, and as the Tassie history, but then we've got Newcastle, and we've got, and a different thing. Now, I know that, of course, as a person, as an individual, you're bridging the organizations, but there must be something deeper as well that's bringing together the organizations. Now, they're modern not-for-profits, but what's the connection? Like, just for those that don't know, how did this, this bringing together come about, basically?
Yeah, so we've been on both sides been thinking about what our place is in a fully mature NDIS and human services sense. And really, I guess, looking at the signals that have been coming out from the NDIS, be they pricing signals or other signals, it was clear to us that we weren't really small enough to be boutique on either side.
Yep. Okay.
And really to be able to be sustainable longer term and to make the impact that we want to make in the community, we really needed to get to a scale that's going to enable us to do that. And I think the evidence of COVID and the impact of COVID on organisations such as ours has really highlighted the need to make sure that organisations are really robust and resilient. And I don't just mean that in a financial sense. What I mean is there's really some depth and capability in the staffing team, so that, it's, the old saying, if someone gets hit by a bus, what do you do? Well, in a really sustainable organisation, you should have the depth of the team that will be able to carry and support the work of the organisation. So there's that aspect. As we've come together, we've been integrating the organisations, putting together a single management structure and a single approach where it's possible to do so, and so really going through that really sort of deep organisational design approach to make sure that those structures are in place to support the work of the organisation. But at the same time, making sure that there is enough flexibility in those structures to be really regionally specific and tailored to the communities that we serve. There's that old saying that sort of goes around, try and think nationally, but act locally. And I think that very much applies to the communities that we work in. In some of the regional communities that we're working, we'd be one of the biggest employers in the town. And so that comes with a level of responsibility as well. So it's about making sure we get that balance right, and ensuring the future sustainability of the organisation. Because really, I think what we're seeking to do is have an organisation that's owned by the communities that we serve.
Okay, really interesting, because because I do consulting, right? I work with providers of all sorts of scale, and what I notice is that even the providers that are on their journey to around, say, the 5 mil level, it's really common that they might even be just breaking even or have very small profit margins. So the reason I reference that is that I suppose it's really kind of healthy to see that, your two organizations, as part even of Alliance 20 and being at that level, it's nice to see that you're taking that how can we be lean so we can serve the community better attitude, right? Because I think that's so important. Like I see, I know you're not for profit, but surplus. Whether it's profit or surplus, having that additional fund, that's ultimately oxygen for the organization, and it has to be there. You're right, for the long-term sustainability. Plus, I think you mentioned the localization thing there. Like here's a microcosm of an example. If I was to do a Google ad campaign for someone, I don't just say have a Google ad for Australia. I want to have something that's specific to the town. Like let's say you're searching for SIL. Let's search for SIL in Wollongong or SIL in Newcastle, and make that part of the way that the user, the participant, the nominee, the support coordinator experiences things. So I think that's really spot on, that you can be national, but the localization, it's kind of almost like linked to web design and the UX, like the user experience now, I think in our culture expects that personalization effect of show me how your organization fits me. That's kind of do you have anything to say on that in terms of the personalization effects there?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I think, when I think back sort of a few years ago, when we were first thinking about increasing our scale as an organisation, we consulted with the people that we support and other stakeholders. And one of the things that was really important for people was to know sort of who was the neck to ring, so to speak. Who do I need to talk to if things aren't going as I'd like them to? Who is kind of in control or in charge of an area or this responsibility. So it was really important to make sure that we had that right, because in many of the communities that we serve, that they have really, really different attributes. Some of them are actually quite well served by other services. Transport's not an issue. Access to housing is easier than in some areas. Whereas other areas that we work, none of those things are very easy, and so the very nature of what we need to do is quite different, and it's being really, really clear about what they are and making sure that we're able to respond in a way that's really appropriate for the type of people that we're supporting in the communities that they live as well. And Australia's a really big place, and right across the country, people live in really different ways. There are lots of similarities, but there are lots of differences as well. And the tyranny of distance is real in some of the communities that we serve. And so we have to think about those things really carefully to make sure that where we are working, we can make an impact and we can connect people with the community infrastructure that's available.
Correct. And it's beautiful because it truly, links to the person-centered philosophy of the NDIS as well, which is so crucial. I'm kind of fascinated. I'm sure, you've got a roadmap, of course, at the level 1 sort of level to say, what steps you need to do. So clearly the org design and managerial structures is one thing. I'm sure IT systems and trying to unify approaches is another. Just from a branding perspective, I'm not sure if this is something that could be publicly discussed yet, but have you made a decision on, how that's going to work? Are you going to move one brand over to the other as a new brand? Do you unify them? How do you even tackle that question? That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. It comes up a lot, actually, in a lot of the consultation sort of mechanisms that we have. Look, I think the short answer is that we will have to come to a view on that at some stage. But whilst we've been going through integration, what we've been focused on is making sure that that we continue to focus on the services that we're providing. We've got a razor-sharp focus on that, and that integration can sort of happen alongside that. Part of the work that we've been doing, consulting with the people that we support and also with our staffing teams, is really trying to think about what is the shared identity or the shared way of looking at the world across both sets of staff, and how do people perceive us and want us to be perceived and viewed in the communities that we serve. And we've called that the Our Beliefs Project, and it's really thinking about, well, what are the things that we believe in that are common to the organisation, irrespective of whether your employment contract says you're at Lifestyle or it says that you're at Possability. Because understanding that, I think, is the first real element before you can even think about branding and some of those other attributes. Because in my non-marketing world, brand is really a reflection of the way that we act and the way that we are perceived and the way that we want to be in the community. And so I think it's important we're really, really clear on that first before we make some decisions around brands. The one thing I will say about brands is Possability is not the first name of the organisation, of the Possability organisation. It used to be called Optia, and it was rebranded probably about 8 years ago. And I think at the time there was a sentiment, well, what's in a name, and why would you change? And some of it was about being able to be recognised and have a name that was a bit more contemporary, that people might be able to engage with in a different way. But changing names is not without its risks as well. I mean, the reality is for some of the people that we've worked with, whether they've been living away from home because they can't live at home with their parents, or whether they've been living in supported independent or living or the like, for a period of time, there is a connection with the name of the organisation that really needs to be considered. And change can be really challenging for people. And so if we do make changes into the future, we want to make sure that we're getting really good advice about how to best do that, but also that we've talked to the people who it will be important to make sure we get it right.
I love it. So, I mean, the values-based, consultative approach, I think is great because it's kind of, it's almost like the Apple Steve Jobs approach to, being values-based in the way that you communicate your philosophy to the world. And I think it's really enlightening as well that on this basically change management huge project that you're doing, that you're not taking a predetermined outcome approach, you're taking the consultative approach, because it would be very easy to say, we're going to do a 2-year project and this is going to be the way it's going to be, and kind of push your way through without taking into account all of the impacts. So that's really, really cool. Nice, very nice indeed. Okay, well, look, let's talk about some of the other things, I suppose. Like, what about? Let me ask you about, because again, you're two organisations, you've got all this change going on, and in the current climate, what would be the top challenges that you're noticing as a CEO in your role? What are the kind of common challenges that you're noticing across both organisations, and how does that reflect on what's going on in the industry?
Yeah, look, I think staff and workforce is probably a key challenge of many human service sectors, not just disability support and out-of-home care. And this is not a new problem. I went to uni in the 90s. And back then, I recall very distinctly university lectures saying that there was a workforce challenge that was, if not already upon us, but certainly imminent and looming. And here we are, some 30 years later, and I think we can all say that that's probably the case. And there are a range of different factors for that. I think we've got very, very low rates of unemployment right across the country. So I think, that's just one of those sort of macro factors that makes it difficult. I think in our pursuit of sort of getting the scheme out really quickly and making sure that we're flexible enough to change to, the changes of the scheme and scheme design and policy and those sorts of things, it has led, unfortunately, to an increase in casualisation across the board.
Yes.
And the challenge is always about, well, how do you be person-centred and really responsive and flexible, but at the same time create meaningful and structured employment where people are really well supported and well trained. And I don't think there's a magic answer to that. I think everybody will have their different approaches and strategies to that. But I do think that workforce is one of the key challenges. For our organisation, it's about 80% of all of the money that we spend is on people. And so, good people equal good services in many cases. And then you've got to add on to that good supports, good supervision, good training to make sure that people can succeed in that context. I think the other real challenges are that for a lot of organisations like ours that have transferred from ultimately being block funded by government into sort of this quasi-market that we're now in, there's a real change that you've got to make to an organisation just in terms of business processes and managing your money, those sorts of things, which means you've got to spend more effort on those. And through the evolution of the scheme, that's become more and more complicated as we've gone along. We've had a few computer system changes, had changes to rules, changes to billing, and all of those have been a necessary evolution of the scheme as it settles in, given the scale of it. But it does mean that we've had to spend a lot of effort trying to respond to those and trying to look into the future to make sure that we're not blindsided by any of those changes that are coming down. And it's really our job to try and keep the noise away from the people that we support and our staff who are providing that support, and also make sure we've got an eye to the future so that we make sure that we can continue our work into the future and be sustainable. So I think they're probably the two main challenges. We've obviously got some important reviews coming up later this year with the report of the Disability Royal Commission, as well as the independent review into the NDIS. And I think they're going to be really formative in terms of, what we can expect to see in the coming years. It's a really important time now for the sector and for the NDIA and other key stakeholders to make sure we're working together, because we have to work together to make this a success, and it's really, really important. And I think, if you think the last 10 years have been spent trying to get the scheme out, and there have been some incredible results for people who weren't getting supports or are under-supported prior to the NDIS. This is our real opportunity to create something new and different with this second 10 years and try and think beyond just getting the scheme out, but think beyond the value that we need to create for the people that we're supporting.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. And it's an interesting time of change, annually as well, because we're recording this in July 2023, and we've recently had, updates to the price guide. So it depends on, it's interesting because like some things like support coordination, they didn't change. Plan management didn't change. Then the personal care supports, community access, they've gone up by approximately just over 5% per hour in terms of billing. SHAD's award for disability, approximately 5% as well. So that's interesting. I guess that's all strategically relative and relevant compared to other sectors such as aged care. So aged care got the long-awaited 15% bump on wages that was long overdue. But then it's interesting because there's like a bit of a comparative relationship between, for providers, like, should I do aged care or should I do disability, or do we do both? Like the business case is evolving. That again is very relevant, you're right, amongst this inflationary environment, because there have been periods where inflation's been as high as 7%. So I literally just recorded a podcast with great guy called Garth Bellick, who's got a company called Paycat, and Paycat, they do payroll solutions with the NDIS. And the reason I'm referencing that conversation is he made a very interesting point. He said historically the Shads Award might go up by about 2%, the price guide maybe about 2%. So we kind of had this big bump up, but it's been necessary for inflation. And I think that wages are very relevant. I do think your point on the casualization is very strategically interesting too, because I've noticed that. I was a director of a SIL provider in Wollongong. Time and time again, people would say at the recruitment stage, just say, can you guarantee me the work? And if you couldn't tell them, even if you're offering them a casual position, you go, oh, we've got plenty of demand, we've got lots of houses, don't you worry about it. I think, or arguably rightly so, employees are like, show me the commitment, show me the reliability. I've got a mortgage, I've got kids, I do think that's interesting, because I agree there's not an easy answer, but gosh, there's a lot of organizations that I know, many that are at, say, the, 30 mil range that are just purely choosing to do only casual, right? And I do think any provider needs to be cognizant of the way the market's moving and always have the finger on the pulse, because it might be necessary for providers that are doing 100% casualization to at least have a blended approach where they have some permanent part-time, some casuals, because my prediction is that I think that's where it's already at and where it's going to go. There's going to be a portion of the market that wants permanent part-time, even as a support worker.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have anything to say on that? Like, again, I don't know what your position is as an organization.
Look, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think our preference is to have permanent staff or permanent part-time as far as we can. I think there's always going to be a component that you'll need to have in your workforce that is casual, but it's not our preferred position at all.
Okay.
And I think some of that is just, the maturity of organisations in terms of thinking about workforce and now we've got a bit of track record to be able to look back on patterns of work and be able to, I think, predict and determine how we can employ people permanently and provide more permanent work. I think it's important on a couple of fronts. I think that the first is that for the people we support, those relationships are really critical. And I think, having a highly casualised workforce, potentially even using agency, isn't conducive to establishing those types of trustful relationships, particularly when we're working in a capacity building approach, because there's an element of sort of trying new things and seeing how they go, and you need a really skilled workforce to be able to do that, but you also need one that's really got strong relationships with the people that they support, and the support network around those people, because ultimately our goal for our work is to make sure that the work makes an impact, and that over time that we need to be doing less of it with the individuals that we're working. And I just don't think that's as easy to achieve when you've got a more casualised workforce with people only partially engaged. I mean, typically in the sector, what you're looking at is that your headcount will be about about twice of what the full-time equivalent is. And I think one of the challenges for providers is trying to get those two numbers closer together, and thinking about what's the best way to be able to do that, whilst at the same time balancing those really real responsibilities about being flexible and responsive to the people that we're supporting in a way that suits their lives as well.
Absolutely. And before my specialization in the NDIS, I used to work in education. So I used to do e-learning and learning management system projects and that kind of stuff for the higher ed and the RTO vet sector in particular. And this point on the permanent part-time or full-time thing, that to me, there's a link, I think, to staff training ultimately leads to a better quality. And if you can have permanent part-time at least rather than casual, I think it also fundamentally links to the traineeship opportunities, right? Because you can't get a traineeship contract for a casual member of staff. You can get all sorts of wonderful schemes that benefit the employee from a training educational point of view, and of course the business in terms of sometimes subsidized wages depending on the state or territory that you work in. So if the smaller operators that are listening to this aren't aware of that, you can sometimes get like 10% wage subsidy depending on the offers that are out there. So like, just out of interest to you as an organization, do you do traineeship models sometimes with your employees?
Yes, we do, although probably in a pretty limited capacity at this stage. But I think it is important. I think one of the things that's been on our minds is a lot of people who come into NDIS specific disability support end up leaving. And end up leaving pretty quickly.
Right.
And I think to some extent, some of that's probably right. I think people are trying something new and worked out that it's not for them. But I think probably the greater portion are leaving because they've not had a good experience and they've not been well supported. And so it's really incumbent on us as larger providers, but any provider, to make sure that we're bringing new people into the sector. We're providing them with really well supported and engaging entries into the work, and showing them that there's a career there in front of them that has many different paths that you could take, so that even if they don't stay with us forever, at least they're not lost to the sector, because actually what that does is it just people moving in and out of the sector just has a net negative impact on the sector generally. And what we want is to continue to build the capacity and capability of the sector over time, and that I think takes some stability, and that's up to us as employers to be thinking about that, and making sure that we've got the right systems and supports in place to ensure that that happens.
Very much so. And you know what? We talked before about user experience, the UX of, our customer, should we say. I think that the UX of our employees matters even more nowadays. And I think about the generational differences. I just turned 40 a few months ago. So I'm a 1983 kid, right? And I'm regrettably, I'm not quite Gen X. I identify as Gen X. I feel like I'm a Gen Xer, but I'm technically a millennial, and that really pisses me off. But the reason I'm referencing that is that I think when it comes to, say the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials, and then of course, Gen Z and all the different like evolutions, right? Each generation is literally looking for different things sometimes. But I know that when it comes to engaging, younger generations, whether it be millennials or younger generations, it's more increasingly common to change organizations, to do this and do that. So it's not an easy answer, is it, in terms of how much you invest? But at the same time, if you do an amazing job in terms of, the culture that you have and the systems that you have, literally the experience of education and development and the purpose and the values, all the stuff that you guys are doing, that I do think, regardless of generation, I think there's an opportunity to create a stickiness, of commitment to the organization.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think if recent past has taught us anything, many people have, I guess, woken up to the realization that purpose is actually one of the key reasons for coming to work. It's, the finance side of it and all the other things that come into it are really important. But I think knowing that what you're doing is contributing to the community, I think is really important. So I think it's about making sure that we can show people in a really tangible way how they're doing that through their work.
Yeah, exactly. Gallup, one of the things I also do is a Gallup strengths coach thing. So it's like a psychometric test. It's like DISC and Myers-Briggs. And I know that there's a wonderful stat that they've got where it says, and this is based on like a study across 2 million employees, so it's very well considered. It's that 70% of the engagement level of an employee is determined by the manager, so by the leader, right? So like, again, great people leading in the right way, not managing, leading. That's all the differences. So I kind of like, I think it's really exciting to see all of us evolve into this place. I see it as like a higher form of consciousness, actually, to say like, I don't want to just go to work and get a paycheck. I want to be led by a good leader and have a sense of purpose and have a good experience in terms of my day-to-day life, and the companies that can provide that, those are the ones that will shine, as well as doing high quality disability care, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really important. One of the things that we've been doing over the last 18 months is, whether by design or just because it happened, I think what ended up with a lot of our frontline supervisors is that they were really good at working out how to deal with rosters, how to deal with NDIS plans, follow-up billing, those sorts of things, which I think were important at the time, but not why we originally employed people. I mean, if you thought about a percentage of importance in terms of why we originally employed people, that would be pretty low down the list. I think making sure that good support happened and being able to provide coaching and mentoring to staff and showing and doing and being really available is probably really important. So we've really consciously changed the way that we're working, particularly in supported independent living, but in other areas, and moving to a practice coaching model. and using active support as our sort of core model in terms of being able to do that. We've been a participant in the longitudinal study that La Trobe University have been running through Professor Chris Bigby for some time. And so really this has been trying to give that some really deliberate structure. And the feedback we've had from people is it's great to be doing the work again and to be focusing on the things that are important. And similarly for the people who are working in those teams, that real singular focus on active support and seeing outcomes has really made their enjoyment level at work really sort of step up a notch. So I do think there's a real skill in being able to give people the tools and give them the supports that they need to do good work, and then to be able to see that good work happening, which is really reaffirming.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one question. You made me think of a question I wanted to ask you. At both organisations, it's wonderful that you've got the coaching model approach, to say the Excel example there. What are the mechanisms that you use to track outcomes for participants in particular?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different things that we do. So we are part of the longitudinal study on active support, and so that's La Trobe University's team coming out and doing observations in support sites, and they effectively come into the home where that's been agreed, and they make observations in terms of the amount of active support that's happening. It's actually really neat and quite simple measure, really, is how much is active support happening in any given hour, and then you get a score from that, and then you get sort of mapped according to the others that are participating in that. But that's a really important mechanism for us because it is independent. And the other part to it is that we know that active support, if done well, can have a positive contribution to the quality of life for people that we support. So that's one way that we do it. The other way is we have a practice team who sit separately from our operational teams. And they undertake sort of participant consultation programs within the organisation. And so what we're really focused on through that is trying to engage with people where communication is more challenging, and making sure that we can hear their voices in terms of how things are going. And so that might take the form of meetings in houses with the residents who live there, with none of the support staff there, so that we can get a real feel for their perceptions on how the support is happening, how the relationships are between residents, those sorts of issues. And we can actively deal with some of those micro issues. But it also talks to, we've got some structured questions we use about how safe people use, how engaged they feel in terms of the teams that support them, how many times they're accessing the community independent of staff. And so whether that's, meeting up with family or friends or going to social groups or whatever it is. And so that gives us a really clear insight into how people are perceiving our services, and probably one of the most useful data sets that we have. We then also have a participant reference group, which and we're just setting up a second one, which deals with things such as when we might change a policy, or when there's a change, we might consult with them to understand if there's things that we need to consider or change in terms of the approach, but also to understand what's important to the people we support. And I'll give you a good example. Some years ago, in Possability, we had a leader at the time who was quite keen on the idea of fundraising to support the operations of the organisation. And so understandably, as an organisation that hadn't done that, there was quite a reticence from a number of staff in terms of, what we do is not charity. People have a human right to be able to receive the supports they need. And so let's not get the two confused. And so we took that to the participant reference group. And it was a really, really useful conversation, and one that the board participated in as well, because it really got to the core of the issue about what the perception might be for the people that we support. And they certainly were very against being seen as the recipients of charity or fundraising or anything like that. And rightly so, because they considered, as we do, that everybody has the right to receive supports, to be able to participate in the community as anybody would. Mm-hmm. Notwithstanding that, they were also very keen on the idea that fundraising could be used for other things, and it could be about setting up different programs like scholarships. It could be about improving access to particular pieces of infrastructure and the like. But I think that got to the core of what's important in terms of that consultation group. And when it's mature enough in a way that it engages, you can really gain great insight into the things that might not be readily apparent and are really worthwhile hearing. So I think that's the other mechanism that we've got in place, and we're really trying to use that in different ways. So, for example, during the integration, we've used that during the integration. And the feedback that we've had has been invaluable in terms of tracking how we're going, as well as adjusting plans as we need to make sure that they consider things that have come through that reference group. And some of that input's been invaluable. It's about how we better support staff. It's about how we engage with the communities that we operate. Really, really high level quality. And I think that's in some part down to the skill of the people who are running those forums for us, but also that sense of safety that people have to be able to share their ideas and opinions.
Wow, love it. That's a very comprehensive ecosystem of measurement, of engagement. Yeah, and I think having that multimodal approach in terms of communication styles and the different verticals as well of the business, like, wow, that's an incredible. I think that's exactly in alignment with the philosophy of the scheme in terms of what's meant to be done. Like, it's kind of making, if we assume that we're at the end goal already, then we're never going to improve. Like, having such a great ecosystem, ultimately, I think that again is almost linked to the coaching mindset, because I'd say that whenever I do coaching for people, we often uncover blind spots. And forgive me for using the term blind, I don't know what to be, but like, I guess I mean that in terms of like, are you aware of of that feedback? You might be something completely left field where you go, gosh, I never thought of that. And also that reference of what are the motivations of our participants versus the organization, because they have to be in alignment. That perception piece around the charity fundraising in particular. Wonderful. Wow, I'm quite blown away. I think that's absolutely fantastic. What an aspiration for all providers to be doing that level of feedback, basically.
Yeah, look, and it's still in development. I mean, we've had to change this as we've gone along, and certainly we're always learning and open to new ideas. And we've seen other examples where there's really great work going on. I think Achieve out of New South Wales have got this really neat program of quality champions that go out and undertake that type of work in the supported independent living sites. I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can do it, and I think one of the things that we've learned over time is that you can't just continue to do something that worked for a little while. Yes. That you've really got to keep changing and adapting as you go along, because people's needs and preferences change, but also the maturity of the participants and people engaged change as well, and they have different needs and different ways that they can engage and add value, which is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And the quality champion is an interesting point as well, because fundamentally, some people see feedback as only related to compliance, but I think it's not just compliance. I think it's customer service. I think you're serving a community, of unique individuals each time. So you've got to connect with that. You've got to take an attitude of, we're here to serve, right? We provide services.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Interesting. Now, you touched upon some of the SIL models there. And I know that you're also the director of Housing Choices, which is a registered provider in the specialist disability accommodation area. SDA is just a whole interesting sector in itself, right? And it's often very misunderstood by a lot of providers, especially the new ones trying to get into it, right? What would you see? What are the trends that you're noticing, and what direction do you think the SDA portion of the broader scheme, what direction is it going in?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I mean, there's been the recent review of pricing, which I think has tried to signal where the NDIA sees need, and where I guess it thinks the incentives have been sufficient to be able to deal with some of the undersupply issues. So I think if you look at that, you'd say, well, there's probably an undersupply of housing that is focused on people who have additional needs and need sort of robust design. There's a real absence of improved livability in a lot of the different communities that we work. And for a range of different reasons, I think, price setting when you've got private sector for profit providers coming in is probably one of the key drivers for them. So I think you're seeing a bit of a settling of the scheme. I mean, as a provider, I guess, we have all sorts of SDA providers knocking on our door all the time saying, have we got a deal for you? We've just built, 4 or 5 bedroom high physical support houses on one block at the end of a train line. What do you reckon? And with no real understanding of the people that will ultimately end up living in the housing. And I think that's probably destined to failure. I think one of the key features of SDA, as it is really for any type of housing, is really a deep understanding and connection with the people that are going to live there. These are homes, and the race to commoditise them, I think, has probably been not very successful in some areas. And there are some great providers doing really great work. But it's a difficult area of work. I mean, these are people's homes, sometimes for life. And so where people are sharing or where they're going to live is really important. I mean, it's a really important decision, one that needs to be balanced against a number of different factors. And if somebody moves out for whatever reason and there's a vacancy, for want of a better description, I mean, absolutely there needs to be real care taken to make sure that the person who potentially comes to live in that house has really good compatibility with the people who are living there, and they've had a say in who their new housemate's going to be. And that takes some time. And so as with all of these things, it's about making sure that you understand the people that you want to serve. It's about making sure that the locations are appropriate. And then it's about making sure that you really manage the property in accordance with the expectations that are set out, because that's actually really important as well. So I think from a provider point of view, that's what we notice. Certainly, as a director at Housing Choices, I think our main concern is about making sure that there's accommodation for people with disability available in the market, in the community housing market. Some of that will be SDA, but some of it won't. And I think one of the things that we're grappling with is really about, well, what is the mix?
Yes.
Because SDA has an additional income stream, and that's why private investments obviously flock to that. And that's an important component that may make it possible where land costs are high and other factors to be able to build in those areas. But there's certainly a real gap for people who don't need SDA but who have additional needs of accommodation. And if you're on a disability support pension living in a capital city and you're trying to get access to housing, it's really, really tough.
It is. Yeah.
And so one of the questions that we think about is, how do we work together to be able to deal with that issue and make sure that there is available supply for everybody, not just those that have got SDA.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating. Thank you for that insight. And you're completely spot on, of course, about the person-centered approach. And I think that, look, again, because I do the coaching, I just all the time see newer providers going like, oh, yeah, we're going to do SDA. Never done it before, right? Oh, my husband's a builder. I hear that, husband's a builder, we'll do it. And there's quite, unfortunately, there's some horror stories in terms of when buildings are not built up to scratch, in terms of trying to get away with, it's pretty bad. That impacts. If you don't have the right fire alarm system, you could be talking about the death of the participant, in the worst case scenario. I think that it's crucial that only the best players are actually in the SDA sector. I do agree that there's going to be lots of sites doomed to failure because of, for want of a better word, there's an arrogance to not, being person-centered, basically, and just thinking it's about property. So, that's definitely a thing. The scheme does have great tools. There's the SDA demand map, that can say, oh, we've got these number of participants in this geography, this is the gap, and all that stuff. But I suppose the other challenge is the time lag of physical construction, right? So you can in theory have 10 people going demand trigger, and they all jump in on the game, but they might again have that lack of awareness of who else is jumping in on that geography. So again, I know personally, large, great philosophy, person-centered organizations that even them, like I won't mention the company, but like I know that they've got challenges, like build beautiful units, and gosh, there's not that ability to align them with the participant because there's been an oversupply as well. So yeah, I think the building thing is interesting. So I do think it's in need of a bit of a shakeup. I think that the natural marketplace, I guess, will do it of its own accord. You know what I mean? There's going to be places that don't work out. I think it's great that this type of conversation is happening, because I hope that might be insightful for people listening that are thinking about it. You got to be so on your A game to be really doing it. And I think it's quite correct that parts of the funding rate, 99% agency managed, it should be like, it's it's interesting. Okay, well, thank you. That's very insightful. So yeah, 3 organizations. You're a good plate spinner. I'm very impressed. So let me see what else. So in terms of, you've given some wonderful insight into the way that, the 3 organizations are run. If you were to, let's imagine you had a new provider sitting in front of you now. Like you've already given a great deal of insight, but if you were to kind of boil it down, what would be your top 3 tips for a new provider starting out in terms of how they should focus on growing their business?
Look, I think really being clear about what it is you want to do, what is it you're trying to set out to achieve, and I think in the not-for-profit space that's pretty clear and apparent. I think it's about making a positive impact, and in whatever way that takes shape. So I think it's being really clear about your why. And then I think the other challenge is in thinking about the work as more than just a commodity. I think the work is deeply skillful. And to do a good job, it needs to be really skillful. And so I think making sure that you come to it with the idea that this is a really professional sector that is professionalising even more and that wants to make a positive impact. So it's about being clear that that's the kind of environment that you want to work in, where there's a lot of scrutiny, and rightly so, and you need to be committed to continuing to want to improve. This isn't a set and forget type of industry, because it's evolving over time. Practice models are changing, the way that the communities that we serve are changing, and so you need to be really adaptive and I think responsive to those types of needs. And the other thing is, I'd say you've got to be incredibly resilient, because sometimes you can have a really good period of time where you're doing great work, getting good outcomes, and other times, for whatever reason, because humans are working with humans, there are issues and areas that you need to deal with. And I think the key to that is being really transparent and upfront, and making sure that where there are mistakes, there's a culture and environment where those can be recognised and dealt with appropriately, because the sort of the care and the protection of the people that we support is a community responsibility. We can do our part, and then the community needs to do their part. And so I think that final sort of part, in terms of what I might say to somebody, is recognise that we're not the only thing in people's lives, and in fact what we're trying to do is to enable people to connect with their communities and to build their own independence, and ultimately the best outcome for that is that we wouldn't be needed anymore. Now that's not always going to be the case, but it's our job to make sure that we can be as little as possible in people's lives, and that their lives are their lives.
Exactly. I love that. That's so sound. And these are the types of philosophical things that will make you stand out, right? Because there's a lot of providers that, unfortunately might be tempted to do the bare minimum. Everything we've talked about in the podcast today is the thing that makes you stand out and truly do that excellence in service. So, Drew, it's been a pleasure having you on. I know you've got a busy day ahead, so I'll let you crack on. But Drew Beswick from 3 wonderful organizations: Lifestyle Solutions, Possability, and indeed Housing Choices. Thank you for coming on the podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have a chat with you.
Thanks, Chris. Love the conversation.
Likewise. Cheers.